New York Harbor, June 1943. The cargo ship pitched in the swell, and through the porthole, Werner Schmidt saw the Statue of Liberty rising from the morning fog like a ghost. He had been told America was dying, starving, broken by depression and racial chaos. But the skyline beyond the statue climbed toward clouds in steel and stone, towers so tall they seemed impossible. The harbor teemed with ships. Cranes moved cargo like mechanical giants, and Werner realized, with a clarity that felt like falling, that everything he'd been taught was a lie. The desert outside Tunis had been hell. Sand in everything, water rationed to mouthfuls, heat that made men hallucinate. Werner Schmidt, 24 years old, had fought with the Afrika Korps for 8 months, watching his unit slowly disintegrate under Allied pressure. The end came on a Tuesday in May. British tanks appeared on the horizon at dawn, moving through heat shimmer like mirages made solid. Werner's unit had no ammunition left, no fuel, no food. They had been holding a position that no longer mattered, following orders that no longer made sense. His commanding officer, a captain whose face had gone gray with exhaustion, gave the order to surrender. Some men cried. Others looked relieved. Werner felt nothing except a strange lightness, like a weight he'd been carrying had finally been set down. The British soldiers who processed them were professional, almost bored. They'd captured thousands of Germans in the final collapse of the Afrika Korps. Werner and his unit became numbers, names on lists, bodies to be transported and housed and eventually exchanged. They were loaded onto trucks, then ships. The Mediterranean was calm, impossibly blue. Werner watched North Africa recede into the distance, the coastline where he'd fought and bled and nearly died fading until it became a thin brown line, then nothing. For 2 years, Werner had lived inside the Nazi propaganda machine. It was everywhere. Radio broadcasts, newspapers, films, posters. The message was consistent, relentless, designed to shape reality itself. America was weak, a mongrel nation, diluted by inferior races ruled by Jews and gangsters. The Great Depression had destroyed it. Unemployment ravaged cities. Crime ran unchecked. The American soldier was soft, cowardly, unwilling to sacrifice. Their equipment was inferior, their tactics laughable, their resolve non-existent. Werner had believed it because everyone around him believed it. Because authority figures he trusted repeated it. Because the alternative, that Germany might be wrong, might be losing, might be the villain in this story, was too terrifying to consider. Even in the POW camp outside Tunis, waiting to be shipped to America, the propaganda continued. Older prisoners, career soldiers, insisted that America was on the verge of collapse, that the crossing would be dangerous because American ships were poorly made, that the camps would be brutal because Americans had no culture, no honor, no understanding of civilized warfare. Klaus Becker, a 19-year-old from Hamburg who had lied about his age to enlist, listened to these stories with wide eyes. He whispered to Werner late at night in the crowded tent, "What if it's true? What if they torture us?" Werner didn't answer. He had seen enough of war to know that certainty was a luxury soldiers couldn't afford. But doubt had started growing in him, a small seed of suspicion that the world might not be arranged the way he'd been told. The ship that carried them to America was a converted cargo vessel, utilitarian and cramped. Hundreds of prisoners packed into holds designed for freight, sleeping on bunks stacked 3 high, sharing buckets for toilets, breathing air that grew staler each day. The crossing took 3 weeks. The Atlantic in summer was unpredictable. Days of calm where the ocean looked like hammered silver. Then storms that tossed the ship like a toy, sending men sliding across the floor, clutching bunks, vomiting into buckets already full. Werner spent hours on deck when guards allowed it, watching the ocean. It was so vast it made Germany seem small, made the war seem small, made everything he'd fought for feel like children playing at kingdoms, while the world continued, massive and indifferent. During those 3 weeks, the propaganda began to crack. The American guards were young, many of them barely older than Klaus. They joked with each other, played cards during their shifts, shared cigarettes and photographs of girlfriends. They treated the prisoners not with cruelty, but with a casual disregard that was almost worse. Like the Germans weren't enemies so much as an inconvenience. One guard, a kid from Ohio with red hair and freckles, tried to practice his German with Werner. "Wie geht's?" he said, grinning at his own pronunciation. Werner stared at him. This boy was the enemy, the oppressor, the force trying to destroy Germany. But he looked like someone Werner might have known before the war. A neighbor's son, a clerk at the market, just a person wearing a different uniform. "Gut," Werner finally replied. "Good." The guard smiled and offered him a cigarette. American tobacco stronger than anything Werner had tasted. They smoked together in silence, watching the sun set over the Atlantic, painting the water in shades of orange and gold that seemed too beautiful for a world at war. The ship approached New York Harbor at dawn on a Tuesday in early June. Werner woke to shouts from prisoners who had gone on deck early, voices tight with disbelief. He climbed the stairs, pushing through the crowd, and stopped breathing. The Statue of Liberty rose from the harbor, green and enormous, one arm raised holding a torch toward the sky. Werner had seen pictures, but pictures couldn't capture the scale, the weight, the impossible permanence of it. Beyond the statue, Manhattan climbed into the morning light, buildings taller than anything Werner had imagined, arranged in canyons of steel and stone and glass. The skyline looked like a city from the future, from some science fiction story, not something that could exist in 1943. The harbor swarmed with activity. Cargo ships by the dozens, naval vessels, tugboats cutting white wakes through dark water. Cranes on the docks moved with mechanical precision. Warehouses stretched along the waterfront, each one larger than anything Werner had seen in Hamburg or Berlin. Klaus stood beside him, mouth open. "This is dying?" he whispered in German. "This is starving?" Other prisoners crowded the rail, silent, staring, each man processing the same terrible realization. The propaganda had been wrong, not slightly wrong, not exaggerating, completely, fundamentally wrong. America wasn't weak. America was a giant that had barely noticed Germany's existence before deciding to wake up and fight. They disembarked at a military pier, herded onto buses with windows covered by wire mesh. The bus drove through streets Werner couldn't fully see, catching only glimpses. Buildings, cars everywhere. Not military vehicles, but civilian automobiles. More cars than he'd seen in his entire life. People on sidewalks, walking with purpose, carrying packages, moving through their day as if war was happening somewhere else entirely. Camp Shanks sat in Orangeburg, New York, a temporary processing facility before prisoners were distributed to permanent camps across the country. The buses pulled through gates, and Werner found himself standing in a dusty yard surrounded by wooden barracks, guard towers, and wire fences. But the fences looked almost apologetic. No machine gun nests, no dogs. Guards stood with rifles but seemed more interested in their conversation than the prisoners filing past. An American officer, speaking through an interpreter, explained the rules. The Geneva Convention would be honored. They would be housed, fed, given medical care if needed. They would work but receive payment. Werner heard the words but struggled to process them. This wasn't how enemies treated each other. This wasn't war as he understood it. The mess hall was a long wooden building with benches and tables arranged in rows. The ceiling was low, the windows tall, letting in afternoon light that illuminated dust motes hanging in the air. Werner filed through the food line with other prisoners, each man clutching a metal tray. American soldiers served food from behind a counter, slopping portions onto trays with practiced efficiency. When Werner reached the front of the line, he stopped and stared. Ham, real ham, a thick slice, still warm, glistening with glaze. Mashed potatoes, green beans, a roll with butter, an apple, coffee. "Move along," the server said, gesturing. Werner moved in a daze. He found a seat, set down his tray, and looked at the food like it might disappear if he blinked. Across from him, another prisoner named Georg picked up his fork and set it down again. His hands trembled. "This is what they feed prisoners," Georg whispered. Werner cut into the ham. The meat was tender, falling apart under his fork. He raised a piece to his mouth and chewed slowly. Flavor exploded across his tongue. Real meat, real food. More food than he'd seen in months. Around the mess hall, prisoners ate in silence. Some wolfed down everything on their trays. Others ate with deliberate slowness, savoring each bite. A few couldn't eat at all, stomachs too shrunken from rationing to handle abundance. Werner finished his meal and realized he was crying. Not from sadness, from the betrayal of it. From understanding that while he'd been told America was starving, American prisoners were eating food German soldiers could only dream of. Klaus, sitting nearby, stared at his empty tray. "My mother," he said softly. "She's on ration cards. A pound of bread a week. And they give us this?" No one answered. There was no answer that made sense. That first night, Werner lay on a bunk in a barracks that housed 40 men. The mattress was thin but clean. He had a pillow. Blankets. The building had electricity, bare bulbs hanging from the ceiling, creating pools of yellow light. Through the window, he could see the camp stretching into darkness. Lights from other barracks, the glow of guard stations. Beyond the fence, lights from the town, civilian life continuing undisturbed by the presence of enemy soldiers a few hundred yards away. Georg, in the bunk below, spoke into the darkness. "How long have they been lying to us?" Werner thought about this, about the years of propaganda, the careful construction of a reality that served the state rather than truth. "From the beginning," he said finally. "Maybe from before the beginning." Around the barracks, men shifted in their bunks. Someone coughed. Someone else muttered in his sleep. They were prisoners in an enemy country, but they were safe, fed, comfortable. And that comfort was more disturbing than cruelty would have been. Because if America was this strong, this wealthy, this functioning, what chance had Germany ever had? Dawn came with a bell. Not harsh, not urgent, just a clear note that meant time to wake. Werner dressed in the clothes provided. Not a uniform exactly. Work clothes, sturdy pants, a shirt, boots that fit. The morning air was cool. Summer not yet settled into full heat. Prisoners filed toward the mess hall, moving in loose groups. No one shouted at them. No one hurried them along with threats. Breakfast was eggs. Actual eggs, scrambled with cheese, bacon, toast, orange juice in pitchers on each table. Werner drank a full glass and felt dizzy from the sweetness, from the vitamin C his body had been missing for months. An American soldier, young and bored-looking, leaned against the wall watching the prisoners eat. "Y'all got enough?" he called out. "Plenty more where that came from." Werner understood maybe half the English, but the meaning was clear. Abundance, casual, thoughtless abundance. After breakfast, they were issued additional supplies: toothbrushes, toothpaste, soap, razors, towels. Each item was new, unused, handed out like it cost nothing. Klaus held a bar of soap and sniffed it. "This smells like my grandmother's house," he said. His voice cracked. Before, all prisoners were required to undergo medical examination. Werner filed into a clinic where American doctors and medics checked teeth, listened to hearts, examined skin for disease. The doctor who saw Werner was maybe 50, graying at the temples, wearing glasses that kept sliding down his nose. He spoke no German but worked with an interpreter, asking questions in a calm, professional tone. "Any pain? Injuries? Illness we should know about?" Werner shook his head. The doctor examined him thoroughly, noting scars, checking reflexes, looking in his ears and throat with instruments that gleamed under bright lights. "You're malnourished," the interpreter translated. "Underweight by about 15 pounds. We'll get you built back up." The doctor smiled, not unkindly, and made notes on a clipboard. Werner wanted to ask, "Why? Why does it matter if I'm healthy? I'm your enemy." But the words wouldn't come in English, and he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. In the waiting area afterward, Georg sat looking shell-shocked. "The doctor asked if I needed anything," he said. "Anything, like I'm a patient, not a prisoner. An older prisoner, A sergeant named Friedrich, who had been captured in the first year of the war, overheard. "This is how they break you," Friedrich said darkly. "Comfort, kindness, they make you forget you're a soldier, make you soft." But Werner heard doubt in his voice, like Friedrich was trying to convince himself. On the second day, they were shown the camp library, a small building with shelves of books in German and English, newspapers from neutral countries, magazines, a radio that played music in the evenings. Werner walked between the shelves, trailing his fingers along book spines. Fiction, history, science, books that had been banned in Germany for years, sitting openly on shelves. He pulled down a copy of All Quiet on the Western Front, Remarque's novel about the First World War. It had been forbidden Nazi literature, declared defeatist and unpatriotic, yet here it sat, available for anyone to read. Klaus appeared at his elbow, holding a stack of magazines. "Look at these," he said, voice tight. The magazines were American publications. Life, Look, the Saturday Evening Post. Klaus opened one to a full-page advertisement showing a family in a kitchen. The refrigerator was enormous, gleaming white. The mother was serving food. The children looked healthy, smiling. "This is an advertisement," Klaus said. "Not propaganda. They're trying to sell appliances. This is how normal people live." Werner looked at the image, at the abundance it depicted, the casual wealth. The assumption of prosperity so complete that companies competed to sell luxuries to ordinary families. Page after page showed the same thing. Cars, radios, clothes, food, all presented not as privileges, but as ordinary life. The magazine was dated 1942, deep into the war, yet showed no sign of deprivation or sacrifice. "They haven't even started fighting yet," Georg whispered, looking over their shoulders. "This is them at peace. What happens when they actually mobilize?" No one answered. The answer was already clear. On the third day, Werner and several dozen others were assigned to work details. The Geneva Convention prohibited forced labor on military projects, so prisoners worked civilian jobs: agriculture, manufacturing, construction. Werner's group was assigned to help build additional barracks for the flood of German and Italian POWs arriving from North Africa and Europe. They would work alongside American civilian contractors, building structures that would house their fellow prisoners. The foreman, a burly man named McCullough with a Brooklyn accent Werner could barely penetrate, explained the job through an interpreter. "We're running behind schedule. Need these barracks finished before winter. You work hard, we get along fine. You slack off, we have problems. Questions?" No one had questions. They spent the day hauling lumber, mixing concrete, learning to use tools that felt foreign in their hands. The work was hard, but not cruel. McCullough swore constantly but didn't seem personally angry. The American workers treated the Germans with wary distance but not hostility. At lunch, they ate sandwiches provided by the camp. Thick slices of ham and cheese on fresh bread, apples, cookies, a thermos of lemonade. Werner sat in the shade of a half-built wall, eating and watching American workers do the same. One man read a newspaper, another dozed. A third carved a piece of wood with a pocket knife, creating some small figure Werner couldn't identify from this distance. These were the enemies, the force trying to destroy Germany. They looked like men on any work site anywhere, tired, bored, thinking about dinner and home and whether it might rain. On Saturday, prisoners were allowed to use the canteen. Each man received scrip, camp currency earned from their work, that could be spent on items beyond basic necessities. Werner entered the canteen with Klaus, both of them uncertain what to expect. The small shop held shelves of goods that made Werner's throat tight: candy bars, cigarettes, razors and shaving cream, writing paper and pens, soap and toothpaste, magazines and books. Klaus picked up a candy bar and stared at it like it might be a trick. "How much?" he asked the American soldier running the shop. 15 cents, the soldier replied. Klaus had earned 50 cents from 3 days of work. He bought the candy bar and a package of cigarettes, handling the transaction with trembling hands. Outside, he unwrapped the chocolate slowly. The smell made Werner's mouth water. Klaus broke off a piece and ate it, eyes closing. "Werner, "It tastes like before," he whispered, "like childhood." They sat on a bench outside the canteen, watching other prisoners make purchases. Grown men excited by candy and cigarettes and writing paper, simple things that had become luxuries under rationing, now available for a few cents of labor. "This is psychological warfare," Friedrich the sergeant said, walking past. "They're trying to corrupt us." But he had a candy bar in his pocket, the wrapper visible. That evening, Werner sat at a table in the barracks with writing paper and a pen. He was allowed to write home, though the letter would be censored. Any military information would be removed. Any criticism of America or praise of Germany would be flagged. He wrote to his mother in careful language, "Dear Mama, I am well. The crossing was long but safe. I am in a camp in New York. We are treated according to international law. The food is sufficient. I have work to keep busy. Please don't worry about me. I miss you and Father and Greta. I think of home constantly. I hope this letter finds you safe and as comfortable as possible. Your loving son, Werner." What he didn't write filled volumes. The shock of American wealth, the collapse of everything he'd believed, the growing suspicion that Germany had committed itself to a war it could never win against an enemy it had fundamentally misunderstood. He didn't write about lying in his bunk at night, calculating. America had barely mobilized. The things he'd seen in New York Harbor, the food and supplies and casual abundance, represented a fraction of American capacity. What would happen when they turned their full industrial might toward war? Germany's factories were being bombed. German cities were rubble. German soldiers were dying on multiple fronts. And America was building refrigerators and selling candy bars and playing baseball. Klaus sat nearby, writing his own letter. When he finished, he looked at Werner. "I can't tell them the truth," Klaus said. "If I wrote what I've seen, they wouldn't believe me, or they'd think I was a traitor." Werner nodded. "So we write about the weather and say we're fine. And we lie," Klaus added softly. "Yes," Werner agreed. "We lie." On Sunday afternoon, the guards organized a baseball game between American soldiers and German POWs. It was meant as recreation, a way to break monotony. But it became something else. Werner had never played baseball. The rules seemed absurd. Hit a ball with a stick, run in a circle, touch bags before someone else touches you with the ball. It made no sense. But the Americans took it seriously. They explained rules with patience, demonstrated swings, showed how to throw and catch. The interpreter worked overtime, translating technical terms that had no German equivalents. Werner found himself in right field, glove too large for his hand. No idea what he was supposed to do. An American soldier on his team, a farm boy from Kansas named Tommy, jogged over. "Ball comes to you, catch it," Tommy said slowly. "Throw to second base, that guy." He pointed. Werner nodded, understanding maybe half. The game proceeded with chaotic energy. Americans shouting encouragement. Germans confused but trying. Klaus at bat, swinging wildly at 3 pitches and missing all of them. Georg accidentally running to third base instead of first, causing confusion and laughter from both teams. In the 5th inning, the ball came to Werner, a high fly that seemed to hang in the air forever. He tracked it, hands ready, and felt it thunk into his glove. The American team cheered. Tommy clapped him on the back. "Good catch, buddy!" Werner stood holding the ball, confused by the praise, by the casual camaraderie of men who were enemies playing a game together on a Sunday afternoon. They lost 12-3. But afterward, Americans and Germans shook hands. Someone produced a camera and took photographs. Werner stood in the back row, uncomfortable and uncertain, immortalized in a moment that made no sense in any framework he'd been given for understanding war. On Tuesday evening, the camp showed a movie. It was German propaganda, a film called Kolberg, about Prussian resistance to Napoleon. The prisoners filed into a recreation building with a screen and projector, expecting to see something that would reinforce their worldview, remind them who they were. Instead, they watched the film with new eyes. The dramatic music, the over-the-top acting, the simplistic narrative of good Germans versus evil foreigners. It looked cheap, fake, embarrassing. Werner had seen this movie in training. Back then it had stirred something in him. Pride, determination, a sense of historical continuity with past German heroes. Now it looked like a child's play. Obvious manipulation. Transparent propaganda designed to make you feel rather than think. When the film ended, the lights came up. The prisoners sat in silence. "Does anyone believe this anymore?" Klaus finally asked. No one answered. The silence itself was answer enough. An American officer stood up in front of the room. "We show you this because the Geneva Convention says you can have access to materials from your home country," he said through the interpreter. "But next week we'll show an American film. You're welcome to attend that too." Next week they showed Casablanca. Werner watched Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman in a story that was both simpler and more complex than any German propaganda film. The Americans in the audience laughed at jokes Werner didn't quite understand. But he understood the craft, the quality of the production, the casual competence in every frame. Afterward, Friedrich the sergeant sat on his bunk staring at nothing. "We can't win," he said quietly. "Can we?" It wasn't a question. On Sunday, camp chaplains offered religious services, Protestant, Catholic, even provisions for Jewish prisoners, though few admitted their faith in a group of former Nazi soldiers. Werner attended the Protestant service, more from habit than faith. He hadn't prayed sincerely since his first battle, when he'd begged God to let him live, and received no answer except the continued sound of gunfire. The chaplain was an American, a middle-aged minister from Pennsylvania who spoke passable German. He read from the Gospel of Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount. "Blessed are the peacemakers. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you." Werner listened to words he'd heard his entire life, but never quite processed. Sitting in this chapel, in an enemy country, being offered spiritual comfort by an enemy chaplain, the words meant something different. After the service, the chaplain stood by the door, shaking hands with prisoners as they filed out. When Werner reached him, the chaplain gripped his hand firmly. "God bless you, son," he said in German. Werner nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. Outside, Georg waited, looking troubled. "I don't understand how they can be kind," Georg said. "We're trying to kill them. They should hate us." Werner thought about this, about propaganda that said Americans were cruel and godless, about the reality of abundance and medical care and chaplains offering blessings. "Maybe that's the point," he said slowly. "Maybe showing us kindness is how they win." "But winning what?" Georg asked. "The war's not fought here." Werner looked around the camp, at prisoners walking in small groups, at guards who looked bored rather than vigilant, at the town beyond the fence where smoke rose from chimneys and cars moved down streets, and life continued. "Maybe they're winning something bigger than the war," he said. In late June, representatives from the International Red Cross visited the camp to ensure Geneva Convention compliance. The visit was announced in advance. Barracks were cleaned. Prisoners were told they could speak freely about conditions. Werner and several others were selected for interviews. A Swiss representative, speaking fluent German, asked detailed questions about food, housing, medical care, work conditions, treatment by guards. Werner answered honestly. The food was better than what he'd eaten as a soldier. The barracks were clean and comfortable. Medical care was available. Work was hard, but not brutal. Guards were professional, sometimes even friendly. The Red Cross representative made notes, his face neutral. "And you have no complaints?" he asked. Werner hesitated. "I miss home, but that's not about how I'm treated here." The representative nodded. "Your treatment appears to exceed minimum standards required by the convention. The camp commander seems to take his obligations seriously." After the interview, Werner walked back to his barracks in a daze. He was a prisoner of war. He should be suffering. Instead, he was healthy, well-fed, safe. And somehow that was more disturbing than abuse would have been, because it meant America could afford to be generous with its enemies, had resources so vast that feeding and housing thousands of prisoners was barely an inconvenience, could fight a global war while maintaining moral standards that put Germany to shame. After 2 weeks, Werner and many others were transferred from construction work to agricultural labor. America's farms needed workers. Hundreds of thousands of men had joined the military, leaving fields understaffed. German POWs would fill the gap. They were loaded onto trucks and driven into rural New York, dispersing to farms that had requested labor. Werner and 5 others ended up at a dairy farm owned by a man named Henderson, whose sons were fighting in Europe. Henderson was in his 60s, weathered by decades of farm work. He looked at the German prisoners with suspicion. "You know cows?" he asked the interpreter. "Some of us," Werner replied in halting English. Henderson nodded curtly. "Show you what needs doing. Work hard, we get along. Cause trouble, you're gone." The work was relentless. Up before dawn to milk cows, mucking stalls, hauling feed, repairing equipment. Physical labor that left Werner's body aching but his mind clear. But Henderson fed them the same food he ate, let them rest in shade during the hottest part of the day, treated them not as prisoners but as workers, evaluating them solely on their effort. One evening, after a particularly long day, Henderson brought beer to the barn where the prisoners were cleaning up. "Did good work today," he said simply, handing out bottles. Werner drank the cold beer and felt something shift inside him. He was useful here. His work mattered, and Henderson didn't care that he'd fought for Germany, only that he showed up and did the job. On their first day off, Henderson drove them into town for supplies. The small village had one main street, a handful of shops, a church, a post office. People stopped to stare as the truck passed. The prisoners wore marked clothing that identified them as POWs. Their presence was obvious and strange. At the general store, the owner watched them carefully, but he sold them what they needed. Soap, writing paper, candy bars they purchased with their wages. A woman with 2 children crossed the street to avoid walking past them, but an older man nodded a greeting. The town was divided, uncertain how to respond to enemy soldiers shopping in their store. Klaus bought a postcard showing the town square, planning to send it home. The strangeness of it, a German prisoner sending a picture of a peaceful American village to occupied Germany, wasn't lost on any of them. "Does this seem real to you?" Klaus asked as they walked back to the truck. Werner looked at the quiet street, the church steeple rising above trees, children playing in a yard, a normalcy so complete it felt surreal. "Nothing seems real anymore," he admitted. In July, Werner received a letter from his mother. It had taken months to arrive, passing through censors and military bureaucracy on both sides. The letter was brief. Much of it had been redacted, black lines crossing out words. But the essential message came through. Werner, food scarce, father working long hours. Greta evacuated to cousin's farm. Air raids frequent. "We pray for you in the end of this war. Stay strong. Come home when you can. Mother, what conditions at home were really like." His mother's handwriting was shakier than he remembered, as if her hand had trembled while writing. He compared her sparse description with his own reality. 3 meals a day, a comfortable bed, safety from bombing, work that paid wages he could spend on luxuries. His mother was starving in Germany while he grew healthy in America. The irony was so bitter, it made him nauseous. Klaus received a letter the same day. He read it once and folded it carefully, hands shaking. "My father is dead," he said quietly. "Killed in an air raid. My mother is living with her sister. They share one room." The barracks fell silent. Several prisoners had received similar news over the weeks. The war was destroying Germany while they sat safe in American camps, working American farms, eating American food. "We should be there," Friedrich said, voice hard, "fighting, defending our country." But even as he said it, his conviction wavered. What would they defend? What was left? And how could they fight against a nation like this one? Massive, productive, able to feed and house its enemies while simultaneously destroying their homeland. The camp showed a newsreel from the previous week, footage from Europe, Allied advances in Italy, bombing raids over German cities, the siege of the Atlantic. Werner watched cities he knew reduced to rubble. Berlin burning, Hamburg destroyed, Cologne a skeleton of its former self. The American narrator's voice was clinical, factual. "Strategic bombing continues to degrade German industrial capacity. Civilian casualties are regrettable but unavoidable. Regrettable but unavoidable." Werner's mother was somewhere in that rubble. His sister, friends from childhood. All of them suffering while he sat in a camp eating ham and playing baseball. After the newsreel, Klaus threw up outside the recreation building. Werner found him sitting in the dirt, face pale. "I don't know how to feel," Klaus whispered. "Part of me hopes Germany wins, but another part—" He stopped, unable to finish. "Knows we can't," Werner said quietly. "Knows we never could." Klaus nodded miserably. One evening, while milking cows, Henderson worked alongside Werner in comfortable silence. The old farmer moved with the practiced efficiency of decades, his hands steady despite arthritis. "You ever wonder why you're fighting?" Henderson finally asked. Werner considered this. In German accented English, he replied, "We are told we fight for Germany, for our people." Henderson nodded slowly. "My boys are in Europe, fighting Germans. One's with Patton, others in the Army Air Corps, dropping bombs." He paused, checking the milk bucket. "They write letters when they can. They don't talk much about why. Just about wanting to come home." Werner didn't know what to say. "War's a funny thing," Henderson continued. "Politicians start them. Young men fight them. And old men like me try to keep the farm running while everyone we love is gone." He looked at Werner directly. "I don't blame you personally. You're just a kid who got caught up in something bigger. But I hope you understand. Whatever you were fighting for, it wasn't worth this." Werner thought about that statement for a long time. That night he wrote in the journal he'd been keeping, trying to process his thoughts. "Mr. Henderson says what we fought for wasn't worth it. But what were we fighting for? I thought I knew. Germany, honor, duty. But now I wonder if we were fighting for lies, for propaganda, for a vision of the world that never existed. America is not what we were told. It's not weak or dying or inferior. It's strong in ways I didn't understand existed. Not just military strength, but something deeper. Abundance, confidence, a belief in itself that doesn't require putting others down. I don't know what that means for Germany, for me, for the future. I only know I can't believe the old lies anymore." In August, 2 prisoners from another work detail attempted escape. They made it 30 miles before being caught hiding in a barn, stealing food because they'd brought nothing with them. The news rippled through the camps. Guards became more vigilant. Trust eroded. Privileges were temporarily suspended while authorities investigated whether the escape was part of a larger plan. Henderson gathered his German workers one evening. "You boys thinking about running?" he asked bluntly. The prisoners looked at each other. Werner spoke for the group. "Where would we go?" Henderson nodded. "Exactly. You're thousands of miles from home. Don't speak the language well. Would stick out like sore thumbs. Best case, you get caught and end up in a harsher camp. Worst case, someone shoots you." He paused. "War's gonna end eventually. You'll get sent home. Till then, seems smarter to just do the work and wait." It was practical advice, devoid of sentiment. But it made sense in ways the old propaganda never had. Later, Klaus asked Werner, "Did you ever think about escaping?" Werner shook his head. "Escape to what? Everything we were taught about America was wrong. Everything we fought for is falling apart. Where would we go that makes more sense than here?" It was a depressing realization, but also freeing. The war was over for them, even if it continued for their country. They could stop fighting, stop believing, stop pretending the world was arranged according to German propaganda. They could just exist, work, wait, hope to survive. By September, the farm demanded all their effort. Harvesting hay, preparing animals for winter, repairing equipment. The work was brutal and satisfying. Henderson pushed them hard but worked alongside them, never asking more than he himself gave. And when the main harvest was complete, he drove them into town for dinner at a small restaurant. The restaurant owner was uncertain about serving German POWs, but Henderson was a regular customer, respected in the community. He vouched for them. "They worked my farm all summer," Henderson said. "Earned a decent meal." They ate steak and potatoes. The restaurant was full of townspeople who stared but didn't interfere. Werner ate slowly, savoring food that was excessive, unnecessary, a luxury Germany couldn't afford. Across the table, Georg looked like he might cry. "This is wrong," he whispered in German. "We're enemies. Why are they feeding us steak?" "Because they can," Werner replied. "Because they have so much it doesn't matter." And that was the truth that had been slowly crystallizing over months. America wasn't kind out of weakness. It was kind out of strength. It could afford generosity because its resources were so vast that treating prisoners well barely registered as a cost. Germany had started a war against a nation so wealthy it could feed its enemies better than Germany fed its soldiers. The outcome had never been in doubt. Only the length of time it would take for reality to overcome propaganda. As autumn deepened toward winter, the farm work shifted. Werner and the others helped Henderson prepare for the cold months ahead, insulating the barn, stacking firewood, preserving food, the rhythms of agricultural life that transcended nationality. Henderson's wife, a quiet woman named Mary, began teaching them English in the evenings. She was patient with their mistakes, encouraging when they struggled, pleased when they improved. "You'll need to know the language better," she said, "for after." After. The word hung in the air. After the war. After going home. After trying to rebuild lives from rubble. Klaus asked her once, "You think Germany will recover?" Mary considered this seriously. "Country's resilient. People are resilient. Yes, I think Germany will recover. But it'll be different. Has to be. Different." Werner thought about that constantly. What would post-war Germany look like? What would become of the men who'd believed the propaganda, who'd fought for a lie? How do you rebuild not just cities but an entire worldview? In December, prisoners were allowed to receive packages from home. Werner got a small box that had been inspected and partially rifled through by sensors. Inside was a scarf his mother had knit, a letter, a photograph of his family taken before the war, all of them young and whole and innocent. He held the photograph with trembling hands. His father in a suit, serious. His mother smiling gently. His sister Greta, maybe 12 in the picture, gap-toothed and happy. Werner himself, 17, thinking he knew how the world worked. None of them in that photograph understood what was coming. The war, the propaganda, the dissolution of everything they thought was permanent. Klaus looked over his shoulder at the photo. "You can't go back to that," he said softly. "That world doesn't exist anymore." Werner nodded. "I know." But he put the photograph on the shelf above his bunk anyway, not because he could return to it, but because he needed to remember where he'd come from, who he'd been before America showed him a different reality. New Year's Eve 1943 arrived with snow. The farm was quiet, blanketed in white. Henderson gave them the evening off, and they sat in the barn's loft watching flakes fall through gaps in the boards. At midnight, church bells rang from town. A new year arriving whether anyone was ready or not. "Think the war will end this year?" Klaus asked. "No," Werner said. "Maybe 45, maybe longer. And then what?" Werner had thought about this constantly. "Then we go home and try to figure out who we are." Georg laughed bitterly. "We're the enemy who learned the enemy wasn't what we thought. What do you call that?" "Human," Werner said quietly. "Just human." They sat in silence as the bells faded, each man alone with thoughts of home and future, and the impossibility of returning to innocence once it's lost. By spring, Werner had been in America nearly a year. He spoke English well enough to communicate without an interpreter. He understood farming in ways he hadn't before. He'd gained weight, muscle, health, and he'd lost something too. The certainty that came with believing propaganda. The simplicity of knowing exactly who you were and who your enemies were. One evening, Henderson asked him to dinner at the main house, not a reward or obligation, just an invitation. The house was modest, worn furniture, family photographs on every surface. Mary cooked pot roast with vegetables from their garden. They ate together, making small talk about the farm, about spring planting, about equipment that needed repair. And then, as Mary cleared plates, Henderson looked at Werner seriously. "War's gonna end eventually," he said. "You'll get sent home. But I want you to know, if circumstances were different, I'd have been glad to have you as a hand. You're a good worker, honest, careful." Werner felt his throat tighten. "Thank you. I'm saying this because you need to hear it," Henderson continued. "Whatever happens in Germany, whatever shame or guilt you're carrying, remember that work is honest, growing food is honest, taking care of land and animals is honest. Hold on to that." Later, walking back to the barn in the spring darkness, Werner thought about Henderson's words, about finding identity in work rather than nationalism, in care rather than conquest, in the simple acts that sustained life rather than the grand gestures that destroyed it. Maybe that was the lesson America had been teaching him all along. Not that Germany was evil or that America was good, but that humanity existed in small acts, feeding enemies, teaching language, offering dignity even to those who'd fought against you. The war would end, Germany would fall, millions would die. But in a barn in rural New York, a German prisoner learned to milk cows and speak English, and believe in the possibility that people could be more than their propaganda defined. And maybe, somehow, that was a kind of victory too. Werner Schmidt was repatriated to Germany in 1946. He returned to a Munich that no longer existed, finding ruins where buildings had stood, strangers where neighbors had been. He worked construction, helping rebuild what Allied bombs had destroyed. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd been fed by the enemy and now rebuilt cities the enemy had flattened. In 1949, he received a letter from America. Henderson and Mary, checking if he'd survived, inviting him to visit if he ever could. Werner kept that letter for the rest of his life. Klaus Becker immigrated to America in 1952, settling in Pennsylvania. He married, had children, never spoke German to them. When they asked about the war, he told them only, "I learned Americans weren't what I'd been told." Georg became a teacher in post-war Germany. He taught history with a wariness about propaganda, about certainty, about believing too completely in any national narrative. Friedrich, the sergeant who insisted American kindness was a trick, died in Soviet captivity. His certainty didn't survive interrogation. Hundreds of thousands of German POWs passed through American camps. They were fed better than German civilians, housed better than many American families, treated with a respect that contradicted everything they'd been taught. Some clung to the old beliefs, but most, like Werner, found those beliefs impossible to sustain in the face of American abundance, American kindness, American strength that didn't need cruelty to prove itself. The shock of that first day, seeing the Statue of Liberty, eating ham, receiving medical care, being treated as humans rather than enemies. That shock rippled forward through decades. It changed how these men understood the world, understood themselves, understood what nations owed each other even in war. America won the military conflict. But the deeper victory was quieter. It was in the meals served, the medical care given, the libraries opened, the baseball games played, the simple daily proof that the propaganda had been lies. Werner wrote in his journal, decades later, "I was shocked by America, not because it was strange, but because it was exactly what we'd been told it wasn't. Strong where we'd been told it was weak, generous where we'd been told it was cruel, functioning where we'd been told it had collapsed. That shock taught me to distrust certainty, to question authority, to judge nations not by their propaganda but by their actions. I spent one day being shocked. I spent the rest of my life processing what that shock meant. The German POWs who saw America on that first day carried the shock home with them. Some buried it, some denied it, but many, like Werner, let it transform them. They had expected monsters and found men, expected cruelty and found kindness, expected weakness and found strength that didn't need to prove itself through violence. Not through military defeat, though that came too, but through the simple, undeniable truth that everything they'd been told was a lie. The shock of America wasn't just about abundance or technology or military might. It was about discovering that the world didn't work the way they'd been taught, that enemies could be decent, that strength could be gentle, that the future didn't belong to those who shouted loudest, but to those who built most thoroughly. That first day in America ended, but its implications stretched forward through time, shaping not just individual lives but the reconstruction of an entire nation, the reimagining of an entire culture. They came as prisoners. They left as men who'd seen through the lies. And that, perhaps, was the greatest victory of all.